Hi, I'm Jerry Portwood, creator and founder of the Queer Love Project and host of the Queer Love Podcast. Over the past year, I've talked to authors and creators and even musician Roddy Bottom, but I haven't yet zeroed in on one of my passions in an area that has affected our way of perceiving and interpreting love, pop music. Since the beginning, music has been a force for change. For some marginalized groups, the simple act of creating music at all can be a form of speaking out against an unjust world. Whether it's a party song or a protest song, connecting with others through music has power. Of course, there's a long history of musicians using their voices to demand a better world or just carving out their space within it, and who better to discuss that with me today than Barry Walters? Barry is a veteran music journalist and a pop culture critic who has documented the intersection of mainstream and LGBTQ plus culture for over 40 years. He began his career at the Village Voice, where he famously came out publicly in a 1986 review of the Pet Shop Boys. Based in San Francisco, he continues to write about how LGBTQ plus artists and fans have reshaped mainstream music. Thanks so much for joining me, Barry.
I'm glad to be here.
Did I get all that right?
Yes, you got it all right. I have been thinking about that Pet Shop Boys review because I received two fan letters from that. One was from John Giannoli, who wanted to start a band. This was it 1986, I think? And that band eventually became Pansy Division.
And I've interviewed John about Pansy Division. I'm so excited that that's actually what spurred it.
And also, I got another fan letter. I believe he was in college at the time, and that was Rob Sheffield, who ended up at Rolling Stone.
Yeah, I love that we both know Rob. I've learned so much from him. He's been generous enough to say that I taught him some things. I don't think that's true, but he's at least nice enough to say it. So yeah, we've overlapped and worked at various publications, Out, The Advocate, Rolling Stone, but we've never worked together. This is the first time we've ever talked. So I'm really excited about that.
Great. Yeah, me too.
So obviously we're talking about the fact that you have this amazing new book that's coming out in May called Mighty Real, and it's encyclopedic. So I just want to know why it was so important for you to publish a book like this for people to discover at this moment in history.
Well, I'd been working on it for quite some time. I believe it took me 9 years. I can't quite fathom how I lived through it. But so a lot happened to America during
Yeah.
that 9 years. But some of it is personal. I had some issues with my heart, hereditary issues, but I had 4 surgeries. It
Oh,
was
wow.
really I didn't know if it was going to work, and I wanted to leave something important behind. I have a stepson. I'm married, and through my marriage, I have a son, and I don't know if there's a word for this, but an adult child who identifies as non-binary,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a trans partner.
Mm.
And so I want to leave something for them and the generation after them so that they understand what was gay life like when I lived it, and more importantly, how we related to music, how the audience and the performers created a culture through hints, codes, interpretations, ways of getting around the mainstream.
Yeah, so let's dive into that because in Mighty Real, you you talk about music not just as entertainment, but as a survival tool and a language for liberation and love. And being in San Francisco during a time when there was a lot of joy and a lot of pain and a lot of death, I'm just curious, like how you've experienced just the United States. A lot of our listeners might not remember this. Like I came of age in the late 80s and early 90s, so I was like on the fringe, but I didn't experience all of the heartache that many people who are survivors of that period did.
Sure. Well, I'd like to start a little before that. I grew up in a suburb of Rochester, New York. Nearly everyone's dad worked at Kodak or Xerox. Nearly everyone was white. And being that it was very much a two business town, there was a strong drive to conformity. And I saw the people on TV and the musicians that I listened to. I have an older brother and sister, and my sister had a dance studio. So I was surrounded by music. I experienced it through them. So I started very early, and I went to New York City for college and lived there from 89, no, 79 to 88, and then moved to San Francisco in some ways as a result of interviewing Sylvester.
Mm.
And
Who
so,
died in 1988?
yes, he did. He died. I interviewed him a few months before he died. I came out here to interview him
Oh,
because I
wow.
had heard that he. Is it okay if I digress like this?
Of course, I love it.
I had heard that he was in the people with AIDS contingent of the Pride March in San Francisco, and that was the very first time that someone said, someone, a celebrity, someone that you would have in your record collections or you saw on TV that said, "I have AIDS." And that was a revolutionary act. And I wanted to
Yeah.
celebrate him while he was still alive. So I interviewed him. I found out that there was a job before that, while I was mostly contributing to the Village Voice. The managing editor there knew that they would be interested in me as a music critic because
Yeah.
they needed one. So I came out here to do that. So the AIDS epidemic, it began while I was just getting settled in New York and coming
Hmm.
to terms with who I am. And then there's this big epidemic. And then I came here, and San Francisco being smaller and the gay culture being more open, I experienced it in a very powerful, strong, immersive way.
Right.
I had friends in New York who had AIDS, but this was like it was a whole community who did it in a way that was more out in the open than it was. I mean, I would see people who were close to death on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So I was already an ACT UP, but that drove me to make my work as political as I could, given
Mm.
that I wasn't Randy Schultz, who
Right.
was here and whom I knew. I wasn't Vito Russo, who I knew in New York, and he moved out here for a while. But those people were very inspirational to me.
Hmm.
However, I could, when talking about musicians like Madonna, when dealing with the rise of first they were recognizably lesbian to gay people, and then many came out. The
Hmm.
rise of women folk and rock and country that happened in the late just it happened really when I was moved out here,
Hmm.
so those performers gave me an opportunity to write about LGBTQ music and sort of politicize things for a daily paper.
That's the San Francisco Examiner, correct?
Yes, the San
Yeah.
Francisco Examiner was a Hearst paper at the
Hmm.
time. It was a prestigious paper. It was an afternoon one, but
Hmm.
we sort of prided ourselves in being a little more progressive and thoughtful. I would go to concerts and come back to the office and write up the review that night, and they would be in the paper the next day. And that it demanded a lot of independence because there were no fact checkers who would know
Right.
the facts that I was writing about. There was
Right.
no internet that I could check a lyric on. I had to know it. I had to
Yep.
know who the musicians in the band were and the background singers and all that stuff. So
It was all in your brain. You were the expert.
yeah, well, I knew quite a bit before I moved out here, but it was a school for me.
But let's talk about Sylvester. I mean, he's obviously an icon, but at the time, disco was definitely not cool. And even to write about disco, right? I mean, in Rolling Stone was known for shitting on disco, and we had the disco demolition and all that that had happened earlier. And yet Sylvester is really such a trailblazer and pioneer, and now is getting this appreciation. I've seen a musical based on his life and music. There's a lot of love, but I would say that probably when you're going out there to write, like there's still people who are like, ugh, disco.
Right. Well, yes and no. Because disco is connected to R&B. Disco is
Hmm.
connected, in the 80s, it was connected to new wave and,
Yeah,
well, of course, Blondie, even in the 70s. So
yeah.
um, when I came here, the Examiner reprinted my Village Voice article, and people at the paper took notice. Like the black secretary said, we haven't had that much coverage of black music, and you are coming in here and you know your stuff. And
Hmm.
so she would turn me on to things. I ended up going to an early NWA show
Oh wow.
with her, and there were gunshots in the show. I mean, not
Hmm.
in the show, but in the audience.
So you were giving your readers access to music that other people might not be reporting on.
Yes, that's right. They were used to just the music coverage mostly being about the San Francisco acts. And I did that too, but I wrote about Metallica,
Right.
who I really did enjoy during that period. There was a band, Jellyfish, that I was
Yeah.
extremely fond of. Before I moved to San Francisco, I saw a show by Depeche Mode at Madison Square Garden, which was extraordinarily gay,
Hmm.
as I get into in that book. And the opening act was Voice Farm, even gayer. They had dance routines, like, and real choreography, outfits, really quirky lyrics. No one in New York knew who they were, and they were being played on the radio here. So I got
Well, that it's good to even get it. I mean, we obviously have the new romantics, and we have things that were very queer coded, and yet people kind of let them pass. We have things like Queen that people, you have these dudes who are loving this band that's so queer coded, but nobody seemed to question. And then even what you're talking about, like just seeing Dave Kahan on stage strutting around is like the gayest thing, even though he's not. But tell me, for you personally, like you talk about music as a life saving recognition, and I wonder if there's a specific song or artist that gave you the language to understand yourself before you had the words for it. Like, is there a sort of like the music for you that you were like, oh, this made me gay?
well, I would say I grew up with my sister and brother's music, and they would alert me to things. So as a kid, Monkees, Beatles,
Hmm.
Jackson 5, Partridge Family. But then when I turned 11, I read this article about a performer I'd never heard of, David Bowie, and it said that he
Hmm.
was bisexual. I didn't even know what that meant, but he looked so amazing. And I have to say, I would maybe by this time people started to mistake me for a girl. And
Mm.
that was when I look at photos from that period, my hair was just slightly longer, but my clothes were brighter. And then when I discovered David Bowie, I that was more real to me than the people around me. Really, I mean, I had friends, but he gave me um, a path and an image and a language that I discovered on my own through him. My brothers and sisters were not a part of that. So that, I think if you have brothers and sisters, older brothers and sisters. When you discover an act on your own, not through them, it becomes like your music. And through David Bowie, well, I heard he produced Moth the Hoople and wrote All the Young Dudes, and whoa, that's an amazing song. And slowly, I think I fathomed what being gay was because I learned about it through songs like All the Young Dudes. I learned about it through John, I'm Only Dancing, and a kind of androgyny that was very pervasive in Hunky Dory and The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and Spiders from Mars. And
it's interesting. I think it's actually such a complex thing to unpack, and we can't go into it in great depth. But I'm curious what you think, because I know, being a little bit younger, but that so many people around me were given permission to maybe be a little gender nonconforming. I had teachers, I had friends, I had people who that way. And even when I later saw like the Runaways biopic, about them, originally going and seeing a Bowie show and then feeling like they can, and it just created, before we used the term, it created a queerness that gave a lot of people permission.
right, well, it depends on how old you are, right? If you're in junior high, which I consider the most volatile place, um, there's that,
You're the sponge absorbing.
yeah, the Netflix show Big Mouth, I think really
Right.
gets it right. And your favorite act is David Bowie, and you're into Queen and Roxy Music and all this androgynous stuff that if I was a big city kid, it wouldn't have been a big deal that I liked all that stuff because they would have heard it on the radio. They would have
Right.
known about it too. But it made me stand out, and that was both good and bad. I had to figure out how to make my difference a positive rather than a negative. And I knew that it was because I ever since I was a kid, teachers would say, "Oh, you're," tell my mom, "Oh, your son's really different. He's really special," and so I got some of that. But when all the Bowie-ness, all the androgyny came in, that specialness became a real problem. And
Right.
I was bullied severely.
Right.
Gym class was no joke. So
Yeah, so there's always that reaction to it too. Yeah.
right. So in a sense, it put me on the path, but it made things more. When I say it, I mean the glam androgynous pop culture. It made things more challenging, but it also made me feel like there's a place out there for people like me. And if you are younger, you experienced the second wave of that stuff through the people that are my age that he touched when performing on England's Top of the Pops, when coming over here. Of course, the New Romantics, Boy George, Duran Duran, of course, Spandau Ballet, Eurythmics,
Yeah.
and then Depeche Mode, Erasure, and all that. So he really sort of liberated a generation, not just the gay ones, but the straight ones who were
Right.
told that masculinity must be very narrow. And also femininity must be very narrow
Right.
because people like Annie Lennox
Yeah.
were doing really creative stuff with gender.
Yeah, she was fucking with gender in the other way. So I remember my mom basically using Annie Lennox as an example of trying to explain to me why one of my teachers was a lesbian, and it was a very complicated thing.
Uh-huh.
Which she probably was wrong, but I understood what was going. I kind of later understood why she was so confused by all of this, like the buzzed hair, the dyed hair, the all that. But that's part of what I want to talk about: this coded resistance and the defiance, and and there's this sort of like radical thing happening, but also trying to stay safe. And even Bowie recanted the bisexual thing, and it was complicated. And and then Elton was going back and forth, like, I'm bisexual, I'm not, all this stuff. And then later in the '90s, we get somebody like Kurt Cobain also saying, like, I'm bisexual and wish I was gay and all this stuff. So it's like these artists are pushing the envelope, but then they're also trying to, maybe it's their managers and agents, but they're trying to also keep something that is confusing to us. We're like, just be a hero. I don't know what it is. What did you? I mean, you were reporting on this, so what did you
Right.
think?
Well, something I guess I failed to mention in the book, because I'm sure it was different from record company to record company and management to management and whatnot. But there used to be, entertainers were beholden to contracts that
Right.
dealt with morality.
Yeah.
Like, so they couldn't do something that was considered immoral, right? And gayness, of
Mm-hmm.
course, was. And I'm not sure exactly when that ended, but that also had to, it was, and I do mention this, that disco happened as a result of the illegality of just merely dancing with
Mm.
someone of the same sex. You had to have someone of the opposite sex, like, with you, or at
Mm-hmm.
least nearby, that you could just pull toward you when the cops came,
Mm-hmm.
if they were to raid a nightclub. So I don't know if that and that happened. That was a vice law specific to New York, but
Right.
I'm pretty confident that those kind of vice laws were in place throughout the country.
And they stayed on the books much longer than people realize.
Yes, and they were enforced longer than they were really on the books.
Mm-hmm.
So the first nightclubs were really sites of revolution where, oh, we're still elite. What we do in bed is still legal, but at least we can do this thing. And you can do it with people of your own people. And also, I think that the utopianism of the hippie movement
Mm-hmm.
really, it sort of got commercialized and watered down in the 70s, but it moved into disco in a way,
Yeah.
that because people were coming together who were all different races, because it disco had a broader appeal than rock and roll as it was in the 70s. I mean, going back, people like the Beatles were played on R&B stations. They were
Mm-hmm.
on the R&B charts at the very beginning.
Yeah.
But things got segregated when, I mean, the companies, the record companies, the entertainment business saw Wigstock. I say Wigstock, Woodstock, and saw all those white kids and just wanted to target them and
Right.
push the R&B into something else. It was all part of, it was all rock and roll
Right.
at the time.
Well, and then we have things to keep talking about the disco for a second. Is Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder, and like the sexualized part of that, and then how people felt conflicted about that, right? And you have like orgasmic sounds, like, and you're listening to this music that sounds like fucking.
Right. Yes, I remember there was a record that predated that, Jungle Fever by the Chaka Chas, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it had heavy breathing on it. It was, I believe, a Belgian studio act pretending to be African.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know what it was, but I thought it was amazing. And so I had that 45 and would play it, and I was just
Turned on.
10, 11 years old. I didn't know what it was, but I liked it.
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting that Donna Summer happened she was an American in Germany. That music, that was Germany's version of what was happening in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia International label and people like the OJs
Mm-hmm.
and also LA, Barry White. So that was their version of Black culture, and it was often fronted by Black women and played by white musicians and whatever Black musicians they could find.
You touch on so many genres in the book, and I want to get to the punk of it all because that's a complicated one. But let's talk about house music and the euphoria of the dance floor. And you talk about that. And I know I met my husband actually on a dance floor. It was like a New Year's party, and there was a lot of whatever music. I won't even go into it, but
Right.
I'm curious about that sort of collective joy that music can bring about, and the social change, and that we do find so many of our intimate moments on the dance floor.
Well, those things, they're not specific to house music, but really house music sort of took over. It gestated in the mid 80s because what happened was that dance music got whiter and whiter uh, as the 80s progressed. And the stations that would play dance music, they were still playing dance music, but it was, but I have to say that there was a Latin presence that
Yes.
wasn't there just a couple of years before. Acts like the Cover Girls, Expose, and a few more that came out of either New York or Miami for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that crack had impacted Black music beginning with right at the mid 80s point, and things got more segregated. The
Mm-hmm.
R&B stations got more R&B and B and less dancey. They got
Mm-hmm.
more about slow jams and people like Anita Baker and Sade, who I
Mm-hmm.
love, but those people didn't have many dance tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And house music had to happen because the Black people, the musicians, were getting pushed out, and house music was like their version of punk, really,
Mm-hmm.
because you didn't have to take music classes to make a house track. You just had to understand rhythm, and really, the house records, a lot of them were based on disco riffs, and so first they started with doing underground remixes of disco tracks, and then they learned how to make their own records, and they put them out on their own labels, and that just energized things once again. And of course, like it always happens, the major labels come in. House music was really um, it was a big deal in England first and in Europe before you could hear it on the radio in America. It was in the top 40,
Yeah.
which is people need to remember, understand that it was, and then they sold it back to us just
Mm-hmm.
like they did with rock and roll and the Beatles.
And the Rolling Stones, yeah. So what do you think of? I mean, I was going out to clubs, dancing. We were, getting the remixes. We were doing all these things, and it was a very gay oriented type of thing. And then we're going to kind of switch to, the other thing that was happening during this time, which is the Indigo Girls and the sort of like folk revival of things happening. So what do you why do you think that happened? I mean, we're also dealing with the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah,
People are needing to have some joy.
right. Well, I think that I knew there was this very specific person that I knew at Hologram,
Hmm.
and he was working in the reissue department. He had me write. He liked the stuff I was doing, the Village Voice, and he had me do. notes for his compilations. And he was, I'm sure he was out, but he died. And when gay men like him died in the major labels, they weren't replaced by other gay men.
Right.
They were replaced by straight guys. And also, dance music labels, dance music publicity, that there were dance music departments when disco was a big deal, because they had to have gay people come in and teach them how to sell records to a gay audience, but a gay audience that they knew would be the stepping stone to the mainstream, because this was happening over and over. I guess I forgot to mention when we were talking earlier that records were happening in the discos so strongly that they would sell in the hundreds of thousands before radio got on board. And when radio got on board, then there were million selling hits. And gay people were hired to promote records in the gay discos because the straight guys didn't know the first thing about it, and they probably thought, I don't want to do that. And so that that whole network got dissipated through the 80s, and by the late 80s, early 90s, gay participation in popular music started gay male
Mm-hmm.
participation in music started dwindling. However, the women were coming up and starting to get signed by major labels. Chris Blackwell, who signed Bob Marley and U2 and produced Grace Jones, produced
Mm-hmm.
B-52s, he saw Melissa Etheridge in a lesbian bar and signed her as a result of that.
Right.
And the first draft of her first album was not that the producers were trying to make her something she wasn't,
Definitely.
which often happened to women because they just didn't have the clout. And Chris Blackwell said, "Oh no, this is not good. I want the woman in the t-shirt and the jeans and the leather jacket. I want that Melissa Etheridge." And so they re-recorded the record, and that was what people heard and responded to.
Yeah.
That record was a big rock radio record, her first album. And then if you went to the concert, then it was really powerful. And you would see other women in the audience. And the same thing was happening with Katie Lang, who
Yeah.
was on Sire Records, a label associated not just with Madonna, but Talking Heads, Ramones, Echo and the Bunnymen, whole galaxy of queer and queer adjacent acts.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a gay man behind it, Seymour Stein. And he signed a lot of acts that were either queer or were acts that we like Depeche Mode.
Yeah.
And
And it's
so,
funny that you haven't mentioned the two biggest, which is Clive Davis and David Geffen, but they were doing their own thing, I know.
right, well, they were really, I mean, Clive Davis, he had Whitney Houston, and he had Barry Manilow, and initially he also had well, for a time he had Lou Reed, and he signed Patti Smith as well.
Yeah.
But he also had this flip side of extremely mainstream acts
Yeah.
like Air Supply.
Yeah.
You can't get any more bland and mainstream than Air Supply, right? So, and really, Sire Records did not have any
Right.
kind of Air Supply on their label. Their bread and butter became Madonna, or their moneymaker, and yet they were still signing left of center acts like Katie Lang, who was doing
Yeah.
country, but in this very punk. It was both punk and performance art.
Yeah, because she was very male presenting and kind of had this swagger.
She had a swagger that was, I mean, she was kind of like Iggy Pop and Elvis Presley. So when I would go to her shows, and well, I saw her first in New York, and then when I came here, I saw her do a New Year's Eve show, 1988 into 1989. I had only moved here like in late November, and so it was the first time when I went to a show, and it was almost exclusively women and almost exclusively lesbian and a
Hmm.
smattering of gay guys, and
Hmm.
people were like, it was like a queer revival meeting. It was so powerful, and she was so good, and her band was so good, and I knew something really extraordinary was happening. And the
Yeah.
same thing happened at Indigo Girls shows, where people were singing along to records that had only been released a few months ago, and they knew all the words. They were, and I also have to say, singing along to at concerts now is a, a de rigueur thing.
Right.
It was not happening back in the late 80s, except in these shows where it was like the closet door was open, right?
Hmm. Well, I have to admit that I've probably seen the Indigo Girls live more than any other act, and also because I went to college in Atlanta, I had many
Okay,
opportunities.
okay.
So yeah, they're definitely very close to me. But and it's incredible to see that they have staying power and have now a new culture. I'm really curious. I want to talk about, because you give people this lineage, and I don't want to force it too much, but one of the things I like to talk about is creating family and heritage for queer people, since we don't have that through our
Hmm.
actual family of origin, right? And so we often do it through our sexual partners or our relationships. But in this, you kind of create this musical family tree. And I was thinking, like, it's 10 years since this is 2026. And 2016, when I was working at Rolling Stone, I was there in January when David Bowie died. I was there in April 10 years ago when Prince died, and then later in the year when George Michael died. It was a pretty intense year for us in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and yet I'm just curious about the sort of lineage. Do you actually feel like, Bowie and these people are connected to people like Lil Nas X and Kim Petras, or is that too much of a stretch for us? And yet we are seeing people like, when I remember talking to Brandy Carlisle when she was just starting out, and how big of a fan she was with Elton, and now she has an album with him, right? So you actually do see this connection.
Right. I do think there is a lineage, and I do think a sense of freedom gets passed down. When I spoke to Amy Ray, she said seeing Patti Smith when I was just a teenager opened a door for me and made me feel like, okay, I can be myself. I don't have to, I can be, well, we didn't have words like genderqueer or
Yeah.
pansexual. Those words didn't exist. But so that opened the door for her. Like, so David Bowie opened the door for Boy George and Mark
Mm-hmm.
Allman of Soft Cell, and those people opened a door for. I mean, I do know that the house music people they loved the English synth pop
Right.
and the androgyny that went with it, and some of them, um, I assumed that I can't remember who Jamie Principle. He sounded
Mm-hmm.
so gay, and I believe he's actually straight, but has said gay people allowed me to be myself.
So I want to pivot slightly. I have a question that I really am curious to see how we can go there. But one of the things that I keep exploring and I'm always curious about, and I want to get your take, is pop music, in my opinion, often skews our perception of love by distilling complex long-term human connections to these intense bite-sized emotions, right? We have these like you're falling head over heels, is the, that kind of thing. And even though it, captures that universal feeling or whatever you want to call this mania that happens, one of the questions I ask all the guests for the podcast is how people define love. And because we're talking about music, I'm curious what you think. Is it that thing that you work over for a long period of time, or is it that strong feeling that we hear in pop songs about I lost I fell in love, I'm just crazy for this person, I'm crazy for you, like so many of the songs are about being crazy, and that's what so many people think love is. And I'm just curious, from your perspective of listening your whole life, being embedded in this, and also just being a man who's fallen in love, like what do you think? Does the pop song set us up for failure?
Well, I'm just flashing back to this. I once went on a couple dates with a guy. I worked at Tower Records that had just opened up in downtown Manhattan, right near NYU, where I was going to school, and dated this guy who had been the manager of a gay bathhouse. Uh, Something I wouldn't have done if I'd been just a little older. I would have known
Mm-hmm.
this is I was getting into a situation over my head. But I was into this guy, but he had, I don't know, a kind of detachment that I think was typical of gay men of that were just a few years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
That you don't settle down with one, you spread yourself around. And he recommended his therapist. And I saw his therapist, and he said, "Well, my therapist is she's lesbian, and I don't know how he framed her as like socialist or anti-capitalist." And I remember her saying, "Oh, well, love isn't like it is in the Motown songs. That's just fantasy." Well, sometimes it is.
Mm-hmm.
It is if I mean, certainly the Motown songs, and I deal with this in the book, that a lot of them dealt with the more painful side of love, and yet the music was very upbeat, and is a very, I think that's a very gay response to the world that we, I've had this argument with people who've said, hey, straight people aren't so great at relationships. Look at the divorce rate. Not like they're doing all this stuff all that well. But a lot of us didn't date men of other boys in high school. We couldn't do that. Maybe we could do it in college, depending on what college we went to. And also, like, if you went to a college that was far away from anyone you knew back
Right.
then, right? So, but by college, your straight peers have already had several years of dating and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So I think I'm not going to say that gay people have an extended adolescence, but I do think we often have to we're working things out in our 20s that some of our straight peers worked out in their teens. We make some of the mistakes that we would have not made, like me dating a former bathhouse manager. He had a very different idea of relationships. So I would say that I was also drawn to people who wrote about love in a more complicated way,
Mm-hmm.
like Brian Ferry of Roxy Music. It was very romanticized, but also the opposite of the romanticism. That
Right.
there was a kind of it was intellectual and romantic at the same
Yeah.
time.
I totally agree with you. I was more of a Smiths Morrissey guy. And so I think I related to that yearning and that longing, and also the idea that you could say, I want to die by your side and be hit by a
Right.
truck
Yes.
and all that kind of
Morrissey. I'm
stuff.
glad you've mentioned Morrissey because he's a perfect example of he didn't go to college, yet he was self-taught, and
Yeah.
he read a lot. And he read a lot of lesbian feminist
Mm-hmm.
literature that shaped his worldview. And he wasn't all that active in the dating scene that
Mm-hmm.
we, if we're to believe his autobiography and the song and what he has said. So he would present a very romanticized notion and deconstruct it in the very same song.
Right.
And I think that was very attractive to people who wanted a mate, wanted to have things work out, but also was smart enough to know that it doesn't often work that way, especially if you're gay and have to hide your feelings, and maybe you got your heart set on some straight guy.
And yet it appealed to all those emo boys too. I mean, they were
Yes,
all there, trying to rip his clothes off, even though they were straight.
that's right. And there, Morrissey has plenty of lesbian fans too.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think if you like more than just what's on the radio, most of us get all sorts of ideas about love through all sorts of musicians. You get all this stuff simultaneously. And now that's even more true of the kids who grew up with streaming, where
Mm-hmm.
just the history of popular music and not so popular music, it's all accessible all simultaneously. And so they can access it.
Well, I hope they discover your book and it screws with their algorithm and they start listening to some other music as well. I actually have a friend named Mark Blankenship who has a Substack where he calls it the Lost Songs Project, and what he does is he actually writes about things that were top 10 hits but now no longer get streams, and so he's trying to like kind of uncover and rediscover for people who are younger, like, oh, this is music that people used to really love, but no one's listening to it anymore.
Right.
And and I think there's a bit of that people will get from Mighty Real. Is there anything that you want to make sure your readers get from this, or that you hope that they learn?
I have really broad tastes in music. If you read my book, you can probably figure out what I really am enthusiastic about. And there's very little in this book that I'm not really enthusiastic.
Right.
And so I am hoping it's designed to be very accessible to people who are like, okay, I want to read about Donna Summer or learn
Mm-hmm.
about disco. And learn about it through a queer perspective. And the book's called Mighty Real, which is a Sylvester song. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that they read about Patti Smith and Frank, and then I've woven in as much as I could some obscure acts that really, if you're gay, this music may speak to you, even if it's not particularly your cup of tea, like the kind of thing you listen to. I was just thinking how in the post-punk chapter, it's not really post-punk, but it's definitely this Canadian group, Parachute Club,
Mm-hmm.
and they had this huge hit in Canada called Rise Up. And if you are gay, particularly if you are lesbian, you are going to hear this song as a lesbian anthem. And I would say less than 1% of the people who will pick up my book will know that song. And then
I don't know
right.
it.
Well, it got some dance club play. I was into it at the time. But if you hear the song, there's no doubt that this is like a lesbian empowerment song. And it won the Grammy for best song. I mean, the Canadian Grammy, the equivalent of the Canadian Grammy in the same year that there were big hits by Bryan Adams and Men Without Hats and Corey Hart, Sunglasses at
Mm-hmm.
Night. This won. And this person has, I believe, the songwriter behind it, she's won a distinction of honor from the Canadian government for her participation in bringing female and lesbian concerns into the mainstream. So that's a pretty amazing thing that just about no one outside of Canada is going
Right.
to know that.
Well, did you create a playlist for this? Are you planning to? Because if not, I'll create
I
one.
am, I'm right now having conversations. Now, readers should know that my book has 60 chapters.
Right.
And some of those chapters, like Madonna has her own chapter and Michael Jackson has his own chapter. But then there are several chapters that have many different acts in them. So there are, I don't know, a couple hundred.
But you could give us your definitive Barry Walters playlist.
Yeah, well, I'm what I just had this discussion. They want to keep it to 100 songs. So I will not be able to represent every artist in that playlist, but I do want to have enough so people understand this book is not just about Elton John and Queen and the acts that they know about, that there's no matter what kind of music you are into, there's something for you to discover. And I'm hoping that you will rediscover the stuff that you do know. And everyone who has read this book and has talked to me about it has said they would put the book down and go on YouTube
Exactly.
and be like, really? Is it that gay? And then watch the video and like, oh my God, this is so gay. I can't, like, I didn't quite get it when I was 8 years old or whatever.
Right.
Um,
No, I love that, and I agree, and I think that so we'll definitely share that when the podcast goes live as well. So that'll be great to include. This has been good. Thank you so much for giving me all of this new knowledge and sharing all of this. I'm excited for people to read, and also you narrate the book so they can listen.
Yes, I recently wrapped up approximately 140 hours of recording in um, a studio that just so happened to, it's called Different First Studios. It's run by queer women and it's entirely queer staffed. And it's actually inspired by the synthesizer work of Wendy Carlos, who is trans. So the audiobook is something that that comes out of a queer background. And I just sort of stumbled. I mean, Bob Mould, who's a friend of mine, he's recorded there along with Devo and maybe, I'm sorry, I spoke. He mixed one of his records there. He didn't record there. But
Well, for anybody who's worried, the audiobook's only 13 hours at the end.
is it? I haven't.
I just looked. I just confirmed. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
So you've recorded a lot, but they got it down. And that's great to hear about Bob. I've gone to some of his dance parties over the years when he's DJing, and that's been fun too. He's a really sweet guy.
Yeah, he is.
Well, Barry, I'm going to let you go. This has been great. Thanks for joining me. And I just want everyone to know that they should find Mighty Real.
Well, thank you. I'm really happy. The reception this book is getting, it's really exciting. It's what I hoped for. So thank you.
And if you're a new listener to the Queer Love podcast and aren't already a subscriber to the Queer Love Project, you can find us on Substack at queerloveproject.substack.com. It's a platform where LGBTQ plus people can share stories and experiences about whatever love means to them. We keep all our words free and publish original personal essays and interviews every week. So go to queerloveproject.substack.com and subscribe and support us today.